So first of all, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bo Diczfalusy, as presented here. I just want to express my happiness to be at this important event. I think it was marked by Minister Åsland, that this is, even the Nordic governments attribute this is considered a very important event, as is, of course, the cooperation around the Nordic electricity market. And I just wanted to start by thanking my former colleagues at the Nordic Energy Research, where I was a senior advisor until some years ago, and also the electricity market group that invited me. So my task today is to present briefly the Swedish Electricity Market Inquiry, or I was told by some more native English speakers, maybe should rather call it a review than an inquiry. Anyway, this heavy report, it consists of more than 800 pages, was handed over by myself to the Swedish Minister Ebba Busch the other day on 24th of April, which was actually one day before the deadline according to our terms of reference. We were very proud to do that. So this work started a little bit more than a year ago when I was appointed special advisor by the Swedish government. At the same day, the government decided on the terms of reference for this review. So why was it deemed necessary to start a new review to look at the electricity market? I think there were several reasons. The most important may be that there was the scenarios, and especially the scenarios that the government paid a lot of attention to, they indicated that there would be a very, very strong growth in electricity consumption between now and 2045. There have been goals adopted not to determine the actual electricity consumption, but to give a view on the level of electricity consumption deemed necessary to attain both climate change goals and competitiveness goals to establish new industries in Sweden. So this was probably the major reason for deciding on this review. Also, it was noted that this kind of increase in both electricity consumption, transmission and production would entail very, very large investments, and also reinvestments, because a large part of our infrastructure in Sweden is getting old, as I imagine it is in other parts of Nordic countries as well. Also, as you all know, we face in some respects, new situation with regard to the market, the complexities of the market. We see new technologies, we see new patterns of supply and demand, we see new kinds of actors like aggregators, storage companies, other kinds of actors. So, and we also, in the few last years, as many of you are aware, we got quite heavy new EU legislation as well that has to be implemented into national law. So in fact, the terms of reference that we got from the government were rather extensive. I think it's 9 or 10 pages altogether. Very fine print, I think font 7 or 8. Very difficult to read. Lots of things that nobody understands were mentioned that we were supposed to review, like contracts for difference, like aggregators, like BSPs and other things that I mean, to be frank, I've been around for a long time, I never heard of them. But anyway, they were part of our terms of reference. Before I proceed, I should just tell you that for those of you who are not familiar with the Swedish government review system, is that in principle there are two kinds of public reviews in Sweden. There is the special review, where you appoint a person, in this case me, to review a certain question. And when this person comes out with a report, all the proposals are sort of all the things that I propose or consider are, in the end, I'm responsible for them myself. So this is the special review. In contrast, there are also parliamentary reviews where you put in lots of parliamentarians in the same room, and they come out in the end with conclusions and a report, and then it's sort of, then the political work has already been done when this kind of review is finished. Just to understand, for you to understand the situation, so of all the proposals that you find in this report, you should blame me, or you should praise me, perhaps, because those are my own. So the government process will start shortly with the report being handed out to the public for consideration. There should be one or more government bills coming out from the government probably next spring, because of this is pressing, but also because there are general elections in Sweden next September. So I imagine that this government would like to make a footprint and have the new legislation in place before the electoral campaign. So this is just for you to understand where we are in this process. Now, the terms of reference that were adopted by the government in January last year, you can see some of them on the screen. It is, as I said, not easy to understand. Within electricity system with clear system responsibility, high security of supply and long-term planning conditions. And then there are lots of sort of detailed questions to be answered by the review. The first thing I did was to appoint a secretariat of 4 people, 2 economists and 2 lawyers, who are the people, of course, that made most of the work, although the responsibility I already mentioned to you. Then the ministry appointed for me an expert group where you had the organizations, the industry organizations, the authorities involved, and all those, and we worked together during this year. We decided, my secretariat and I, rather early, that to make people understand our task, you can see it on the right-hand side, it's about how we future-proof the electricity system. And I will tell you a little bit about both how we worked and what we found. We also we have tried to be very transparent during this review process. So we organized 3 or 4 major public hearings on different parts of the story, or the terms of reference. We have tried to meet both traditional actors and new actors and all kinds of stakeholders. So probably thousands of persons were involved in some respect in the work. Now, coming to the actual work, and sorry for this big prelude, but I thought it could be useful for you to understand what the process in Sweden is like. I imagine that processes in the other Nordic countries are similar. Like many of the other Nordic countries, Sweden has a favorable point of departure. This is not necessarily reflected in the public debate, where there are other words used for the Swedish electricity system. But from what I understand, we have a favorable point of departure. We have a nearly fossil-free electricity system with hydropower, nuclear and wind, and also actually some solar coming up with 3 or 4% of production last year, and increasing. And very little, there are some bioenergy, and there's a little, I think, I look at Per now, I think you may find some oil and gas residues almost used for peak load and other reserve capacity. But like 99% or more is fossil-free, which is, of course, compared to many EU countries, is an enormous advantage. Also, against public conventional wisdom, electricity prices are maybe not low, but among the lowest in Europe, according to EU statistics. And again, we have a high reliability. There is a stable frequency. There is some story going around that frequency is deteriorating in the Swedish and Nordic system. The opposite seems to be true according to Svenska kraftnät. The frequency is actually getting more and more stable, and it's getting closer and closer to the 50 hertz. And in Sweden, we had almost constant electricity use now for 25 years or more, despite huge economic growth. Partly, of course, this is due to structural changes in the economy. Partly is due to increased efficiency, but this is the starting point. This does not preclude that there are challenges or problems, if you want to call them that. First of all, we had, like I guess in all the countries here, very volatile electricity prices. And in particular, we had very large geographical price difference between north and south. So this reflects the fact that a lot of electricity production takes part in northern Sweden or in the northern half of Sweden, while consumption is taking place in the southern part. But of course, then the fact that we have new actors, we have new technology, so that they also contribute, of course, as we all know, to volatility and to price differences. There have been connectivity issues, that is, companies who want to start a new company or to expand their activities had problems of connecting to the grids. They were refused, they were told that maybe in 5 or 10 years. So this is another problem that we see that should be resolved in one way or the other. Another way of expressing this is to say that there is a poor match between electricity production, I should say, transmission, distribution, and consumption, and this is an important part of the task of my review. And then adding to this, of course, is the geopolitical uncertainty which we all face, but which puts new demands on the robustness of the electricity system. So these issues also have to be addressed. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, electricity consumption in Sweden is expected to increase sharply, and especially for industry and transport. Now, in the last half a year or so, because of the problems in the world economy and other problems, some of the industrial projects are now might not, some of the big industrial projects that are supposed to bring about increased electricity consumption may not happen or may not happen exactly right now. So forecasts have become more and more uncertain. But I think this does not change very much of my work or the work we did, because what we do is to prepare the electricity system for a higher level of electricity, both production, transmission, and demand, regardless of the actual outcome. So maybe we get the higher figures in 2055 or 2060 or something. It doesn't change the underlying picture that there's a large need for investment, for reinvestment, and for a closer dance between production, transmission, and consumption. And also, of course, it adds to uncertainty that we see new players with new characteristics, and I talk about storage company, I talk about aggregators and other kinds of new actors that I think their existence and development should be taken into stock when we discuss competitiveness and secure electricity supply. So, trying to interpret our terms of reference, we found 3 different tracks that we worked along. The first one being a well-functioning electricity market. The second, how to achieve a better coordination and operation and planning of the electricity markets. That is both operational issues, but also planning issues to make production meet transportation to meet demand in the end. And thirdly, we had a somewhat special issue where we had a great use, I should say, of the experiences in other Nordic countries, both Norway, Finland, and Denmark. It has to do with customer focus. I'll come back to that in a second. So trying very briefly to go through our findings. So the first task was about a well-functioning electricity market. And the major problem that was reported to us and that we found in our task was the fact that although lots of investment should be needed in all parts of electricity systems, the incentives for this investment are very weak. That is, we see before us low prices, we see unstable prices, and we also see problems of getting long-term contracts. So how do we address this issue that we want lots of investors don't want to invest in the market right now? And I guess this is a sort of a typical problem in the infrastructure, in the industrial business, but nevertheless, it should be addressed somehow. This is especially true for capital-intensive electricity production, such as nuclear. You know that there's a big discussion on the nuclear production in Sweden, and I believe also in Norway, but that's another thing. And also for offshore wind. So these two kinds of electricity production typically have a very high capital cost in the beginning, and they will take lots of time, maybe 10 years or more, before they start to produce electricity and thus money back to the investor. So there is a financing issue that somehow maybe there is a role for the state, for the public authorities to get in there. And it's not only about getting a certain kind of electricity production, it also has to do with the capabilities of these production plants. So you need, in some cases, you need to address the issue of localization, you need to address the properties. Is this a sort of baseload plant? Is this is it a plant with a low variable cost, etc.? So to sum up this, the electricity market needs better tools. So our proposals, if you care to read our full report, and before you do that, please send me an email. I explain how you should read it. There are lots of proposals and what we call considerations, which in some cases is not a legal proposal, but rather that some authority or somewhere should look closer into this matter. So also trying to identify some important matter. But there are some proposals. There is a proposal on introducing possibility for contracts for difference. I guess most of you are familiar with these, with CfDs, as they are called. There is a current proposal by the Swedish government on nuclear power. The basic idea is that the investor gets a fixed minimum price for electricity during a long-term period, maybe for 20 or 30 or 40 years. And in return, if there is a surplus, if the investor gains more money than expected or what is deemed sort of necessary, some of it should be paid back to the states, to the public. So this is, I'm trying to illustrate that in the picture. So we propose that not only for nuclear, as already been done by the government, but also for offshore wind, which in some respects have similar problems with long-term, a big initial capital investment. We also addressed the issue, and I'll get back to that, for when there is a problem, when there are periods when it's difficult to meet the, where this power system is strained. It might be a winter day, but it might also be a summer day, in fact, when it's difficult to match the supply and demand. We looked into the question whether what kind of capacity mechanism, and should there be a need for a full market a capacity mechanism, or is it enough with the current strategic reserve we have in Sweden right now? After lots of consideration, we concluded that the full capacity mechanism is at the moment more costly than the benefit that it brings. There's a lot of red tape, a lot of investment, there are spillover effects. So our conclusion is that the strategic reserve should be enough for maybe the next 10 years. But I'll come back to that. This might be a good area for Nordic cooperation, and I look at my friends at the ENG group here as well. We also had the task of looking at system services. I guess most of you are familiar with system services or ancillary services. This is like the mayonnaise. You organize a big party, you buy all the food, you invite all the guests, and 20 minutes before they arrive, you realize that the mayonnaise is missing. So this is, most of you don't seem to understand what I'm talking about. I'm sorry about it. So this is the little extra push that makes supply meet demand at every second and every microsecond of the operation of the system. So these are system services. There is a continuous development among TSOs because there are TSOs who run these ancillary services. We propose that inertia, which is brought in by big heavy turbines, that at least it should be explored by Svenska kraftnät whether this could bring in extra money for those providing it. If you invest in a nuclear power plant or a hydro plant or something with a big turbine, whether there should be extra remuneration for the services that they bring. We also looked at the EPAD contracts. I do think that those of you engaged in TSO services are familiar with it. So these are price contract between the different areas. This is a product that was introduced by Svenska kraftnät because of the large price differences between different parts of Sweden. So our recommendation is that Svenska kraftnät continues to develop these, and also that the issues of EPADs is raised on the EU level. So this is the first part. I hope I'm not talking too much. I guess I'm invited here to talk, so look. So the second part has to do with the coordination of electricity generation, grids, and demand. Very briefly, to have all these, it's like a dance to making these three legs working together better than they do now, so that we don't get connection problems, we don't get overcapacity in the north and undercapacity in the south, etc. You probably can't read the figure, and don't mind, you find that report, you probably won't understand it anyway. It was put together by our lawyer, but it shows the changing roles of the system operator, and this is the kind of, I'll not go further into it, but the whole point is that, say, a distribution company nowadays has a much broader responsibility than what they had in the 1990s when we started the deregulating process. So in the Swedish case, when starting deregulation, and I was heavily involved in that, starting in the end of the 80s and then taking place in the 90s, we were inspired by the Norwegians and by the UK. But to find the natural monopolies, we had to point out someone, so it became the distribution companies. And as the EU legislation developed, we decided, okay, our distribution monopolies will be the new system operators. It's not self-evident because part of it has to do with the legal monopoly. The other has to do with the system, the responsibility for keeping up the system. So but a lot of the things we did now in my review, first of all, the electricity grids obviously have a much larger role in the electricity system than what is generally considered, say, by politicians or in a general discussion. We tend to talk about either whether we should have nuclear, wind, solar, or something else, or on the other hand, we talk about consumer issues or taxes. But in fact, I think the electricity grids are the eternal part, but also maybe the most important parts in many respects. So one of our findings is that there is, in spite of the fact that companies and other consumers are refused to get connection, In fact, there is a lot of spare capacity in the grids. I mean, we call it air in the networks. I mean, for an electrical engineer, that is nonsense. But for ordinary people, we don't use the full capacity of the grids. And there are ways and means of using them more efficiently, and partly through new actors. But we have to adjust legislation to that, and that is what we did. So if you are interested in legislation, you should get directly in the first 150 pages of my report, and you'll get what you need. What all these proposals that we do, legal proposals that we do, they underpin the need for a clear division of responsibility, planning, and coordination in the area of distribution grids. But also, as the system gets more and more complex, we get new actors, we get new flows, we get everything, the TSO will get a broader and more important role. And many of our proposals aim at the TSO role. The planning needs, we even propose that it's put into law that at least distribution companies and higher up in the hierarchy have to cooperate better with Svenska Kraftnät than they do today. So this may have profound implications for our regional grid companies, for example. They'll find that they get much more responsibilities than they actually have today. So this is to sum up, and this is very complicated. So I will not go into detail, but it has to do also with adapting Swedish terminology to the EU terminology, because as I said, we started, as did I think all the Nordic countries, we started earlier in this process than did the EU. I was a negotiator there in 95, and we're still working with the first internal market directive. So therefore, at least in Sweden, we adopted terms, roles, and things that are not necessarily in compliance with the EU. And that has, as we go along, we get the grid codes and everything, it gets more and more complicated and unclear who is supposed to do what. So a big part of our work has been to streamline Swedish legislation with EU legislation. The final part has to do with customer focus. It's a very specific question, but in fact, we had a lot of help from from the other Nordic countries. So this is called assigned electricity contracts in Sweden. This is what happens if you are a consumer, an electricity consumer, and for some reason you decide you don't want to choose your supplier. I mean, you may be a foreigner, you maybe have a handicap, whatever, there might be a reason. It's not that you make, but for people who do not choose their supplier. There was a system introduced in the 90s for Sweden, where this happened, this household or company that didn't choose to make a choice, they are assigned an electricity supplier. And this is good in the sense that everyone gets electricity until, I mean, they get bust or something, but they get their electricity. The problem is that the choice then made by the grid company is not transparent. In many cases, we have observed that this means that those consumers, these non-active consumers, they get a too high price, or they get a much higher price than other consumers. So we were asked, part of our assignment was to look into this task. And what we proposed in the end is that we should abolish this system. We looked very closely. I know in Norway there's another, different systems have been tested in Norway, but we took special, we were impressed in particular by the system used in Finland and to some extent Denmark, when there actually is a competitive process. And in the end, although it sounds very harsh, to get electricity, in the end, you have every customer have to sign some kind of agreement to get it. So we hope that this will lead to more active customers, and we have legislative proposals on that. Now, So this is not all. Again, this, of course, because there's so many specialized questions that we had to look into. And you're, of course, welcome to read it, to get back to us and have questions. I was reflecting a little bit on what some parts that could be of significance for the Nordic cooperation. There might be other parts, but so everyone here is probably not familiar with the FCA 2.0, but this is the EU, this is the grid code, the process with EU regulations, the so-called grid codes. In this particular case, it has to do with capacity allocation, and it has bearings on what I said on the EPAD contracts of using price area differential contracts to secure, to secure contracts to get secure prices. So this is a typical area, if very technical, but if you can find a Nordic line, joint Nordic line of action, I think this would be very useful. A second thing, and I told you a little bit about CfDs, contracts for difference. So in Sweden now there is a process both for nuclear, and we propose also a possible process for offshore wind, although we have lots of reservations. You should not have any state support schemes until it's strictly necessary, because you might end up in, of course, with everything being regulated and funded and guaranteed by the state, which is not what we want. But under certain circumstances, it might be useful for the state to issue CfDs. But I think, of course, if this is done in Sweden or any other Nordic countries, they will have effects also on other parts of the Nordic markets. I think it would be favorable. I don't know what the EMG is planning here, but for me it sounds like a subject that is worth digging into. A third area has to do with capacity mechanism. This is an old, I shouldn't say battlefield, so this has to do to guaranteeing the effect also when the system is very strained. What we found and what everyone finds is that if one country decides to go for a capacity mechanism, this obviously has probably big effects for the neighboring country, in our case, for the other Nordic countries, but even for Germany, Poland, and Lithuania, so countries that we are connected to. So this should typically be done in Nordic cooperation, because there are spillover effects, there are mutual benefits to be gained from a joint work here. And finally, and again, get very technical, I told you that we at least ask Svenska kraftnät to consider to give remuneration for inertia for heavy turbines. Again, if we started to do that and this had any effects on the installations of such turbines, again, this has repercussions for the whole Nordic area, because the frequency is the same all over the place. So this is another area to look at, ancillary services and system services of different kinds. So thank you for taking all the time for getting all these nitty-gritty things, and please let me know if you want to discuss any particular part of this. Thank you very much.